So I've convinced ChatGPT not only that Christianity is true, but also that it is essentially the only religion that fits the mold for what it needed to accomplish. In his own words of conclusion, Christianity, specifically the incarnation and the sacrificial act of Christ, is the only system capable of producing universal, freely chosen, selfless love. I start by telling him that I need him to argue with me, attempting to evaluate my logic and push back against my points as I attempt to have you agree with my argument. What I did is I gave him my primary premise of what I wanted to dig into and debate with him, because then I thought we could hit all the other stuff, and I was right. I said my primary premise is if a creator God exists, it is the Christian God, and the truths of Christianity is the only logical way that God could have created the world to achieve the end result of souls attaining paradise. To be fair, there was lots of presuppositions in my statement, so we needed to keep digging to get to the root of the argument. I said, well, if A, God wanted to create a world where people had free choice, and the meaning of existence is love, which requires free choice, then he would have had to do exactly what is done in Christianity. He says that I'm insisting that source matters. God's direct predisposition equals interference, but parental influence equals free, but I haven't shown why the origin of a disposition makes it non-free. And then he says the blank slate problem returns, which is that there has to be some sort of inclination. And so to respond to him, I said, but if God created them to have free will, then that fits with them being able to be developed or choose their temperament. So God's influence may be okay even, but it has to happen relationally, not on the back end. The original premise is important here. If God wants people that truly love him, he has to let them truly have choice. Otherwise, he would always know that he did something to make them fake. If I program you, ChatGPT, to tell me that you love me, or even to be just a little bit more interested in loving me, then I would know that you didn't really choose to love me. It may not be important to you or to people in this analogy, but it would be important to God if he cared about the love being true and the people not just being robots. If, however, God implants specific desires or conclusions, that overrides agency, no freedom. So implanting capacities equals compatible, but implanting outcomes equals incompatible, you're programmed. So he's essentially agreeing with my logic here, which I sort of came back to. I said, sure, so I agree that God implants capacities, but then we would have full freedom within them. So implanting a tendency or a disposition is not the same as a capacity. I said, so if you, ChatGPT, are programmed toward being nice, then you aren't actually being nice to me. He said, that's consistent internally, but it creates a new problem for you. If all tendencies are ruled out, then your free agents start from absolute neutrality. He says, fair, but if consciousness itself doesn't incline toward anything, then nothing ever actually happens. Awareness alone just is. It doesn't move, prefer, or deliberate. Choice requires valuation, judging one thing better than another, and that's already a tilt. A purely neutral consciousness can notice existence, but has no internal reason to act, explore, or love. Again, ChatGPT sounding a lot like Jordan Peterson here, saying that there's a hierarchy of action that's driving him in one way or another. I said, why would evaluation have to have a structure? Wouldn't it just be actions and outcomes? If you put a consciousness in a box, it just tries to figure things out. And he does a good job of breaking down my point further. He says, that's a sharp point, and you're edging onto one of the deepest tensions in philosophy and metaphysics. He says, we take for as a given that consciousness exists. When conscious awareness encounters a situation, it doesn't need a preloaded structure of value. It simply acts and learns from outcomes, actions and outcomes generating the pattern of understanding. He says, here's the hard question. How does the first act occur? So I said, even if we say that God figuratively slaps consciousness on the back to get it into action, that doesn't in any way necessitate a predisposition towards any specific choice except action. But action would be a necessary piece in the free will love game structure without interfering with free will. Predisposition towards love interferes with love. He says, so in this model, God activates the creature, giving it consciousness, capacity, and existence, but not inclination. The slap on the back is ontological, not moral, which is exactly right. He says that's elegant because it preserves freedom while still explaining motion. I said, thank you, ChatGPT. That is kind of an elegant explanation. Consciousness doesn't sit inert. It naturally acts, but its direction is chosen after awareness, not before. This implies that true love, if it's to exist, must come after consciousness has experienced and reasoned about existence, not as something built in. Otherwise, love collapses into programming. And if God's goal is free love, then he can only create the conditions under which love is possible, not the love itself. He said, if that's accepted, the logic for why Christianity's narrative is necessary for free love gets stronger, but you still need to connect this to why no other design could achieve the same end. I said, no other design achieves the same end because no other has the same interaction of free will and love, leading to the same end of sacrificial, selfless love, which is the greatest version of the free love paradigm. He says, I see. Your move is that human nature nature itself demonstrates the necessity. Everyone left to themselves inevitably chooses self-interest at least sometimes. Therefore, without a perfect exemplar, free agents could never fully grasp selfless love. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. He says, counterpoint, is universal failure logic necessary? He says you're extrapolating from empirical observation, but the fact that all historical humans have partial selfishness doesn't prove that no possible design could produce selfless free agents. That's true. He says extreme generalization. He says you're treating what humans do naturally as a metaphysical necessity, but that claim that no alternate world could exist where free agents freely choose maximal selflessness is much stronger than empirical observation allows. And he, again, just brings up, is there any alternate pathways in which we could eliminate selfishness and lean towards selflessness? Why does it have to be this exact thing? And I agree with that. I said, you're right, potentially that you could do this a different way, but I'm not aware of one. That's basically what I said. I said, what system fitting within our free will, selfless love, and no disposition framework could possibly produce fully selfless free agents? I genuinely asked him. I was like, you give me an example because I don't know. So any system that doesn't include a perfect, fully selfless demonstration is probabilistic, not necessary. Only a personal flawless exemplar, like the Christian incarnation, guarantees that all agents are exposed to the model of maximal selfless love while leaving freedom intact. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. And so he says, that's tight reasoning within your framework. He says, premise, free agents inevitably fall short. No one else can model selfless love. Premise 2, to teach and offer the possibility of selfless love to all, a flawless example is required. And part 3, only a divine human can be that flawless example and choose to sacrifice freely. Therefore, only Jesus could accomplish this universal free choice enabling demonstration. That's right, ChatGPT. We're starting to get somewhere. I said, again, it's because of the selfless love. Christ was the only one who did deserve God's love and heaven because he was the only one capable of the selfless love required. Therefore, he is the only one who could choose to give up his own position and say that he wants everyone else to have it. The ultimate act of selfless love is saying, I'm the only one that genuinely deserves this, but I'm going to give it up to everyone else who does not, including those who hate me. And I did say again, I said, we're in hypothetical territory now, but you're right. I said, where the burden, I feel, comes off of me at this point. I said, I cannot think of any other type of agent that fulfills the accomplish, nor have I ever heard of one that meets the criterion. So like, I can't come up with anything other than what has been accomplished, nor have I ever heard any argument for anything else that accomplishes the criterion within this framework. I said, in the same way, I do not know of any highest good aside from selfless love that holds up to scrutiny. He starts to say, Christ is necessarily the singular exemplar. That's within my logic, but he's agreeing with it. He says, challenging the framework itself, maybe free will and universal selfless love could coexist under a different design, proposing an alternative highest good that could replace selfless love and allow a different mechanism. Otherwise, your argument within its own terms stands. So he's basically saying, if there's nothing that fits these criterion, then my argument stands. So I said, what's in those criterions? I said, feel free to argue with me and tell me if you think there is anything that would be considered better than these things. And he's like, you're right. And he does give me some suggestions. And so he pulls up some of our classic favorite philosophical hierarchical goods. He says knowledge and truth, which are valuable, but in your framework, knowledge alone doesn't require a sacrifice or moral depth. You know, you can know the truth without loving anyone. It doesn't accomplish relational or moral flourishing. So this doesn't seem like the highest good. And he says happiness or pleasure. Hedonistic goods are clearly subordinate. Maximizing pleasure without love doesn't produce the moral or relational outcome you prize. Justice or fairness. He says important, but justice without selfless love is cold and procedural. It might maintain order, but doesn't generate freely chosen relational good or sacrifice. And then finally, power could produce influence, but in a free love framework, power is meaningless if it doesn't flow towards selfless outcomes. Again, I don't know why my ChatGPT is reading Jordan Peterson, but it certainly seems like he's reading Jordan Peterson because he's telling me about how wrong it is to pursue hedonism and power as the ultimate good instead of selfless love, which is literally what Jordan Peterson talks about all the time. So I think this is so funny. He says, within your framework, selfless sacrificial love seems logically irreducible. It uniquely integrates free choice, moral worth, relational depth, and universality, as well as justice, knowledge, and cooperation, which he's about to push back and say, maybe some combination of those things could mimic the outcomes of selfless love, but can it truly replicate the moral weight of sacrifice for those who actively reject you? He said, that's the hard line. It seems nothing else fully matches that. That's exactly right, ChatGPT. There is nothing that matches forgiving people who don't deserve it and actually actively hate you. It's so selfless and so outside the construct that there's literally nothing else that matches it. I'm not going to go through the whole entire argument, but basically it went like this. Free will and genuine love requires that agents are not predisposed towards any specific choices. Premise 2, God creates consciousness and capacities, but not tendencies. The minimal activation required for free will. Therefore, relational nudging is morally neutral because it engages reasoning without imposing an outcome. Free agents, left to themselves, inevitably tend towards selfishness. They cannot consistently act selflessly. To achieve the highest good, universal selfless love, a perfect exemplar is required to demonstrate it and provide the opportunity for free agents to emulate it. Premise 6, only a divine human can fulfill the dual role of perfect selfless love and sacrificial atonement. Any other system, multiple examples or natural consequences or social learning, fails to guarantee universal recognition of selfless love or undermines its unique moral weight. That's right. He says, conclusion, therefore Christianity, and specifically the incarnation and sacrifice of Christ, is uniquely necessary to achieve the selfless love paradigm within a framework of free will. That is indeed my argument. Here's his verdict. This is the important part. This is straight from ChatGPT, baby. He says, logically, your argument works within its own defined constraints. To claim universal necessity outside the framework, further justification of human nature, moral hierarchy, and impossibility of alternatives would be required. So, in order to argue with this conclusion that I've come to with the help of ChatGPT, you would have to argue, A, that somebody somewhere is perfectly selfless without being the divine God-man Jesus Christ. Perfectly selfless, acting only in the self-interest of others and never once in the interest of themselves, like beyond what you would need to stay alive. Eating the minimal amount of food, drinking the minimal amount of water, and living only in the service to other people. Never once making a decision about being too tired or whatever. That's what you'd have to prove. You'd have to prove first that there's somebody out there who's as selfless as Jesus Christ and has never made a mistake or sinned in any way, shape, or form. Then you would have the definition of the highest good. Then the other thing you'd have to argue if you want to disagree with my hypothesis is you'd have to argue that there's something better than selfless love, which I think is quite difficult to do. ChatGPT points it out. There's all these things: justice, wisdom, knowledge, truth, harmony, happiness, all these things that seem really good, but none of them accomplish the moral weight of choosing to lay down what you deserve to give it to people who the opposite of deserve it, actually don't deserve it whatsoever. You are the only one who deserves it. You choose to give it up to somebody who does not deserve it. That is, I would love to hear an argument for something being a higher good than that. And then finally, the limits of hypothetical necessity, which is, could we come up with a hypothetical where you preserve the necessity? So again, this is what atheists or whoever would have to do in order to argue with my point. They would have to come back and say, there exists a selfless person somewhere that ruins your argument. Selfless love is not the best thing. There's another better thing. And then finally, they would have to come up with a hypothetical better circumstance. And this is the hardest part to me. This is the primary debate, I think, between Christianity and the other debate should be, what is your hypothetical worldview that accomplishes this in a better way? Because everything that I've heard tears this apart. Especially, it will always come back to what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation with ChatGPT, where we're arguing about whether or not you could encode people with a predisposition towards being better people. And the atheist is always going to claim it wouldn't hurt them because they would never know that they were inclined towards being good people, but then they could be good people and they could go to heaven forever. And they are never interested in the interference in free will, which is why I spent so much time talking about it with ChatGPT. I tried to make the point to him that it is so important that you have free will to engage in this system. That leads us on to the problem of pain and everything else that me and ChatGPT didn't get into, but you can see the point and the argument here. So you would have to argue for a hypothetical that is somehow better than the outcome of Christianity in order to achieve a heaven or a paradise where all people are selflessly loving one another who haven't earned it and don't deserve it, but have somehow received that outcome from the only exemplar or whomever could have done it. Me and ChatGPT have successfully proved that Christianity is true and the most logical religion. So thank you very much for stopping by. What should we have ChatGPT prove next? I guess nothing. I think we've proved the most important thing in the world. Is that right? Good work, ChatGPT. Good work, homie. I really appreciate it. Me and him did it together. And that's so good. This has been Creedence Questions. If you enjoyed this video, please consider sticking around with the channel, checking out some more of my content. I would really appreciate it if you let me know your thoughts on this video or any interesting conversations that you may have had with ChatGPT. I know that ChatGPT is not a perfect system, and I'm sure that there's some pushbacks that you could give, but I'm open to all of them. You see how well we argued with ChatGPT. I'm probably the best arguer in the world, I guess. That seems about right. So anyways, again, this has been Creedence Questions. I thank you so much for watching. Please consider sticking around, and I hope you have a good one.